Here's our graph. Here's what we're making. Let's get right on to it. So I've gone ahead and just gone up to our new substance here. In our templates, I've gone down to my new template. And if you don't have this option, make sure to take a look in the description below where you can find a video I've done to create our own template. And then I've just gone ahead and named the graph Burnt Wood Tutorial. We also want to make sure that our size mode is relative to parent. And I'm going to go with a 2K width and height. I'm just going to hit OK on that guy. And we're going to get this graph here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come to our base material. And I'm just going to right click and drag that guy into our view. So we're just going to basically use this as our output for our view. I'm also going to come into our materials, go to default and edit, and I'm going to bring the scale up on our height, and this is going to allow us to see any of our height outputs with actual parallax occlusion. I'm also going to come up to our scene here, and I'm just going to go down to rounded cylinder, and I'm just going to use this guy for our visualization. And now to start off, I'm going to go ahead and create a cells 2 node. And I'm going to plug this guy into our normal and our height. And I'm going to come over to our normal here, and I'm just going to bump up something like 5. And it's not going to really show any difference now, but as we continue along, we're going to notice much more of a difference. So I'm going to take this guy back here to give us some space. And I'm going to come into our parameters here. And I'm going to play around with the scale and the edge width. And I really want to bring the scale down so that we're going to get larger pieces. And I'm going to use this as our larger factor. So I'm going to go with something like 10. And I'm also going to heavily decrease the edge width so that we got nice, tight, and slender lines in between. And we're going to use these as kind of the basis of our wood chips, or like our burnt wood. And so on top of this guy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a warp, and I just want to kind of add a little bit more of noise and direction to our lines here. And so I'm going to add a Gaussian noise and use this as our gradient input here. And so immediately it's a little bit too intense. I'm also going to decrease the scale of our Gaussian noise. And I'm also going to play around with the intensity, just decrease that a little bit. Just so that we're not getting very straight lines. And again, something like this down here, you can see I don't really want. So I'm going to, again, play around with our scale a little bit. And that's looking pretty clean. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to add a transformation 2D at the end of this. And I'm going to come over to our height. And right now we've got it just as a square, but I kind of want to stretch it vertically. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to actually make our height 200. And I'm just going to apply height. And you can see it's just going to stretch it vertically. And we're going to get a little bit more of a rectangular or oblong looking cells here. And so now that we've got this, I'm going to take all of these guys and highlight them, and I'm going to hit Control D. And that's going to duplicate them, and we're going to do this one more time. Except with these guys, what we're going to do is we're going to make them a little bit smaller, and then we're going to blend them together just to break up some of the monotony of our tiling. So I'm going to make these a little bit smaller, something like 14. Again, looking at the warping, I might increase the scale of our Gaussian. Taking a look as well. And I'm probably going to play around with the scale one more time. And that looks okay. And so I'm going to add a blend node, and I'm going to take this guy down here and our smaller ones up on top. And I'm going to plug these guys in. And so now what we're going to get is just basically our top one showing up, and I want to add something into our opacity slot here to kind of gradiate between the two of them. And so we're going to be able to see both. And I want to do that randomly. So I'm going to add another Gaussian noise. And I'm going to plug that guy in to our opacity here. And bring that down so it's a little bit easier to see. And with our Gaussian noise going into the opacity, what I want to do is I want to add a levels node. And this is going to give us full control over what we're going to see showing up here. And you can see it's already started to take effect because we have such a decontrasted node here or information. So if I start to increase the black and the white, you can see that certain areas are going to show up more, certain areas are going to disappear. And I want to have a little bit of a transition between our white and our black so that it's not just a straight cutoff. I also want to go ahead and decrease the scale of our Gaussian, and you can see how that's going to affect our end result here. And something like that's even a little bit too noisy. And you really want to decrease the scale. You can play around with the disorder as well. And trying to find a nice central spot on our levels node here, just to add a little bit of variety. And you can see now if I play around with our smaller cells, it's going to help just break up the monotony of our single-sized cells here. So I'm going to hit Control Z. And for now, that's looking pretty good. So now I want to go ahead and start giving some of our cells here some geometry and a little bit of edge wearing too. And so I'm going to add a bevel node here. I'm just going to shift and left click and bring that selection into this guy. And I'm just going to finish off our last group here by just plugging that into the bevel. And so we're going to get a pure white node or texture here. And that's just because our distance is way too high. As I bring this down, you can see that we start to see our cells. And so I'm going to bring this kind of into the negatives here. I'm also going to increase our smoothing. And so what the smoothing is going to do, if I bring this back down, you can see that we've got some pretty sharp geometry. And as we increase it up, we're just going to kind of blur that that sharp geometry there, and it's going to give us a little bit of a kind of like an indent outwards. And so that's just going to help us get a little bit more height on our cells here. And so now that we've got some geometry there, I'm also going to just decrease that a little bit more. I want to go ahead and start adding some little bit of cells and cracks in our wood here, because with some charred wood, we're going to get a little bit more destruction kind of on each individual cell. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to add a cells 1, or actually no, scratch that. I'm going to add a cells 2 node. And I'm just going to add a blend onto this guy here. Making sure that our cells are in the foreground here and our bevel is in the background. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this guy R multiply. I'm going to really decrease the edge width there. And we can see what it's doing right now is it's basically just taking all of the white values and getting rid of that. And then it's just going to keep the darker values. I'm going to come back to our cells. I'm going to increase the scale a little bit just to make them a little bit smaller. And I'm also going to add a warp to these cells. If I bring these guys up, I'm going to add a Gaussian noise. I'm going to really decrease the intensity, and I'm going to increase the scale of our noise too. To something like that, just a little bit of variety. And so now I'm going to come back to our blend here, and I just want to decrease the opacity because they're going to be a little bit superficial and not very deep into our actual material there. So I bring that down, going to get just a little bit. And so that's just a little bit of the surface detail that we're going to get. So what I'm going to do is add another blend onto this guy here. And we're going to do pretty much the same thing. And so I'm going to take these guys here and Control D those. And I'm going to bring that in. Okay. So making sure that we have our blending mode to multiply. Bringing our opacity way down. I'm going to come into our cells. Change around the disorder a little bit. As well as the Gaussian noise, playing around with the disorder. And so this is just going to give us a little bit of variety on the wearing of our cells here. And now the last thing I want to do is I want to kind of add some random geometry to our cells because right now they're pretty rounded and pretty smooth. And so what I'm going to do, bring all these guys back first so we have some more room to work. I'm going to take a directional warp. I'm going to take a Gaussian noise. And so I'm going to take our Gaussian and bring that into the input. So right now we're just having a Gaussian with no intensity or any gradient. And I'm going to use the direction of our warping here, or our cells, sorry, and use that as the directional warp. And so you can see nothing's going to happen right now, but if I bump this up to something like 200, you can see it's going to start to take the form of each one of our cells. And you can see as I play around, it's going to kind of warp towards the direction of the gradient that we've put into our intensity here. And so I'm going to peel this right down so that we get a little bit more, or I guess a little bit less of an intense direction. I'm also going to play around with the scale a little bit. And then I'm going to add a blend onto this guy again, making sure to keep this one plugged into our intensity and then this one plugged into the background. And so I'm going to take this directional warp here and I'm going to plug this into the foreground there. And you can see it's going to give us some more noise and bump. And so with that, I'm going to go to the blending mode and I'm going to come down to overlay. And you can see what overlay is going to do is just kind of add some of that information over top of our blend here. And so we're going to get a little bit more warping and bending. And we can also play around with the opacity just to get something that we like. And again, playing around with scale, we can get a little bit noisier or a little bit less noisy depending on what we really want. And so I'm going to play around with the scale, maybe bump it up a little bit more. I'm also going to come over to our normal and I'm going to bump this up to 10 just to help us see what we're doing a little bit nicer. And I'm also going to come to our histogram range here and I'm going to bump that up to 1 right now. And so we've effectively been able to create a little bit more height geometry and a little bit more cells and noise detail to our burnt wood. And so now that I've completed the kind of inner damage of the little cells there, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more of larger scale geometry or distortion to our height map here. I'm going to come in and I'm going to start by adding a warp node onto our blend, and I'm going to drag that guy over. So the first way I go about creating that is I just do a pretty standard Gaussian pass. And so all I do is just bring this guy in, and immediately it's going to start warping things pretty hardcore. And I'm going to decrease the warp intensity a little bit, making sure to double click. And I'm also going to decrease the scale a little bit too. I might come back and increase the intensity. Again, just to add a little bit of variation. And so now what I want to do is I want to come in and add a little bit more edge destruction, so everything is not so nice and smooth. And so to do that, I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And with this, I'm going to plug into our slope here just a fractal sum base. And this is going to give us some nice noise to kind of destroy our edges a little bit. So if I plug that guy in, immediately it's going to basically destroy our entire thing. So if I come into samples here, bring that guy up, come down to intensity, and now you're starting to kind of see the shapes again a little bit. And so I'm going to come back into our fractal sum base, and we've got some properties to deal with, and I'm going to bring our max level down just to kind of decrease the scale, I guess, so that we get larger shapes. Bring up the mid level 1 or 2. Playing around with the global opacity as well, make it a little bit darker. And I'm going to bring down the roughness a little bit too. Maybe bring it back up a little bit more. And just really fine tuning it to get a little bit of a kind of jagged effect there. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to come back to our slope blur here. And I'm going to zoom in real close. And we've got our mode option. And so what we can do is min is going to kind of take away from the values here. If we do max, it's going to add to the values. And if we do blur, it's going to try and blur between those two. And you can see on our shapes here, and if I go min, it's going to kind of deteriorate away from our object. If I do max, it's going to kind of add divots hanging outwards. And then if I do blur, it's going to do a little bit of both. So I'm going to go with min just to kind of take away and, subtract from our height here. And now I'm noticing that our value is a little bit too dark, and it's a little bit too, I'm going to say contrasted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a levels node onto these guys. And I'm just going to bump up the black output a little bit. Put the white value a little bit down. I'm also going to bring in our white value a little bit, and I'm also going to change our mid gray to just kind of lighten everything as a whole so that we're getting a little bit more height with our values here. And I don't want to directly affect the histogram range just yet. So that's, popping a little bit more, and we're starting to see more of the normal map. But I want to kind of do what we did with the end of this chain here by using a directional warp, just to add a little bit more disgruntled or displaced height variation. So what I'm going to do again is I'm going to add a blend onto this, bring this guy over here. I'm going to add a directional warp, making sure to take our values here and use that as our intensity. And now I'm going to create a little bit of a noise. And what I did with this is I took a Gaussian noise, created a slope blur grayscale, and I used the Gaussian for both the grayscale and the slope. And so I increased the samples and decreased the intensity as well. And we can also play around with the blending modes again. And I'm going to leave that on max. We can also play around with the scale of this. I'm going to go about 20. Yeah, something like that. And now I'm going to plug this into our directional warp here. And so if we start playing with the warp angle, we're going to notice a little bit of our effect taking place here. You can see. But I'm going to bump this up to something like 80. And now that's going to give us just kind of a random warp along our geometry here. And it gives us just kind of a random warp that we can use to kind of overlay over top of our blend here, just like we did with our wearing. So I'm going to plug that guy in, come to blending mode, and go down to overlay. And I'm just going to decrease the intensity as well. And again, you can see how it's affecting our material if I just switch the warping angle. And again, you can bring up the intensity or decrease the intensity to whatever fits kind of your look. And so now the last thing I want to do is go ahead and add some scratches that are going to kind of take away from our height here and make it look a little bit more like it's fibrous. And so we're going to add a blend onto our chain. Bring this over here to work with. And I'm going to add a directional scratches node right at the bottom there. And so I'm going to plug this guy into our top here. And immediately it's going to be going the wrong direction, and that's the first thing I notice. So I'm going to come into our node, make sure to set our angle to 90 degrees so it's going up and down. And I want to come to our blend here, and I just want to make sure I hit subtract. And so what that's going to do is take the lighter values and just subtract them from any lighter values that are coming in from our previous node here. So immediately what I'm going to notice is that it also is very noisy. And you can see in our scratches, there's a lot of scratches that really isn't leaving much in our initial material. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to find our pattern amount. I'm going to bring that guy right down and we're going to start to get some of our material back. And you can see that even with as very few scratches as we have here, it's still pretty noisy. As well, I want them to follow kind of the curve of our initial geometry here. And so, like we've been doing in the past two groups here, I'm going to add a directional warp, and I'm going to use this as kind of a gradient for our scratches to follow. And so I'm going to add a directional warp there, making sure to take this guy and plug him in. And you can see immediately it's going to kind of follow the contour of our height map here. And we can play around with kind of how it's being affected. We can play around with the intensity as well. And I'm going to stick with something like 15. And now when I come into our blend here, because our values are so heavily white, they're going to subtract a lot from our initial material here. And so what I want to come and do is just change the opacity right down very low, because I don't want this to be a significant value, and kind of something like that where it's pretty low and there's not a huge indent, but it's just enough to give you the idea. And so now we've finished the geometry or the height information for our material, and I'm going to go ahead and start plugging in all of our outputs. And so I've got our outputs just plugged in there. So I'm going to go up to our albedo here, and I'm just going to use a uniform color for now. And I'm just going to set this to grayscale, and I just want to be like kind of like a mid-gray tone there. I'm also going to come down to a roughness and do really the same thing. I'm going to take a uniform color, make sure to set it to grayscale, and I'm going to do about a mid-gray. And now for our height, I'm going to come down to our uniform color once again, plug that guy in, make sure to set this to grayscale, because we aren't going to have any metallic parts on our wood here. So we're pretty much done with that guy. So I want to start by coming back up to our albedo or base color here And I'm going to work on this one first because that's where most of our information is going to come for this material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to where we have our height here. And I'm just going to single click and bring that guy into our base color. I'm just going to get rid of that. And so right now we don't actually have any of these outputs showing up in our 3D view. So what I want to do is just right click in our graph, come up to view outputs in 3D, and now we're going to get all of our outputs showing up on our 3D model here. And so now the reason I plugged in the height map into our base color is because we're going to use the gradient of the height to kind of layer off different segments of our material, and we're going to apply different textures to our base color. So the first one I want to do is I'm going to add a gradient map. And we're going to use this to get a kind of a base color for our albedo here. And then we're going to be able to refine that as we go down our chain. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the gradient editor. And we're going to get this pop up here. And I'm just going to click on our spectrum. And so now we've got two handles, and basically it's going to work just like a levels node does. And you can see once I crank up the bottom value, it's going to crank up the black. If I crank up the top, it's going to basically almost kind of look like an ambient occlusion map. And so again, as you saw there, if I pull up, we can get rid of handles as well. I'm going to bring that back up to a white. And I'm going to leave this as kind of a little bit less of a black. And actually, I'm going to bring this guy down to just a little bit. I'm going to crank this down and crank this one up. And I'm really just going to start blocking out different gray values. And I just want to get some variety in what we're actually creating here. And I'm actually going to darken that just a little bit. Maybe bring that back down. And I'm going to do something kind of like that. It's just going to be the block out, and we're going to add a lot more variety as we work our way through. So now I want to start by kind of randomizing or adding a little bit of edge wear to our color here. And so what I'm going to do is add a slope blur. And again, I'm going to just add a fractal sum base. And it's going to give us some nice edge destruction on our colors here. And if we zoom in, it's going to, again, pretty much destroy everything we have. But we increase the samples, decrease the intensity there. And I also want to come into our fractal and decrease the levels. Maybe bring up the roughness a little bit and the opacity. You can also change the blending mode, probably to min there. And now it just kind of looks like it's a little bit of some chipping damage. And it's pretty subtle, but it will actually help a lot once we continue along. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to start by adding some kind of grunge along the lower areas of our geometry here. And so again, I'm just going to add a blend. And I'm also going to come into our library here, and I'm going to find something like, we'll take a B&W spots 1. And this is just going to give us some random noise. And I'm going to plug that guy into our blend. And you can see we get a red connection here because we're trying to plug in a grayscale node and trying to blend it with a color node here. And so what we have to do on our black and white spots is we just have to add a gradient map. And so as soon as I do that, it's going to show up over top of our material. And I first want to start by colorizing it a little bit. So I'm going to come back into our gradient map. I'm just going to play around with different gray values once again, just to kind of randomize different patterns. And something like that looks pretty good. So now I don't really want this pattern to show up on the top of our material here, but I just want to kind of have it in the crevices. So what we can do with that is if we come back to our height geometry here, I'm going to have a histogram select. And so when I bring this guy in here, you can see what we can do with this is we can play around with the position of our height here. And we can select various areas specifically, which is pertaining to the different ranges in the height of our height map here. We can also change the contrast to make it a straight mask. And essentially that's what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a mask for where we're going to mask off these different areas. And so once I plug this guy in, it's going to make a little bit more sense. If I decrease the range and increase the position, you can see that right now it's only going to show up on the higher parts of our material. And if we take a look here, you can see that's exactly what it's going to be doing. And so if I play around with the position of this, now it's going to only really do the creviced areas or the lower recessed areas of our material. And you get a little bit of edge noise along the kind of the sides of the cells here. We can also increase the range to have it kind of come up a little bit more, and we can increase the contrast to make it a lot sharper. You can see here that we've got a nice sharp line. Now I don't want it to be that contrasted, so I'm going to bring that back down. But a little bit of contrast does help it pop a little bit more. So I'm going to continue along with our chain. And I'm going to do pretty much the same that we've just done. So I'm going to do another blend. And now this time what I want to do is I want to have a little bit of our mid-level albedo or base color here. And so this is going to be a little bit darker. And so what I want to do is I'm going to take another B&W spots. This time I'm going to use a 3, plug that guy in, add another gradient map. And again, I'm just going to play around with the ranges here. And so for this guy, have that a little bit darker. Crank it up, crank up our black. Play around with some values here. And we can do something like that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the histogram selector we already have, hit Control D to duplicate it. And now I'm going to plug this into our blend. And so when I play around with the position, you can see that we now have basically 2 masks that are independent of each other that we can add information onto. So decrease the range on that one a little bit. Maybe increase it back up a little bit more. And I think it's still a little too gray, so I'm going to come back, bring this down just a little bit. Again, we don't want it to be all the same color. We want to have some variety. And that's looking good. I'll bring that back a little bit just to keep clean. And now the last thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit more of an ashy kind of effect on the tops where we've got just this kind of pure gray value. And so again, I'm going to do the same method where I just blend it together and use a histogram select to kind of mask off a certain range. And so I'm going to take another B&W 2 just to add some more variety to it. Add a gradient map. Control D on our histogram select. And I'm just going to plug that guy in. And so with this, I'm going to really decrease the range. And I want to bring the position up kind of to the top of our map here, our height. Now, actually, I might increase the range a little bit more and just bring this up very far. And yeah, something like that. And so again, it's a little bit too white. I want to kind of dial back on our white values here. If I click there, really bump up our gray, bump up our black. Maybe have a little bit of white in there. And something like that's looking pretty good. And so the last thing I like to do with my albedo is I like to add a sharpen node onto the end. What that's going to do is just kind of pick up a little bit more of a contrast to our colors here. And it's really going to help sell some of the cracks and scratches. And you can see here, if we take a look, it's a little bit blurry. But once we add a sharpen onto it, you can really tell what each of the grooves and the features are. As well, I like to come into the end of our chain and I like to add an HSL node. And this just allows us to desaturate things just a little bit. And that's going to help us, again, just push the effect of burnt charred wood a little bit further. So we've completed our albedo and I'm going to come down to our roughness. And right now, all we have driving our roughness is a solid gray texture. And so that's going to make everything pretty uniform in terms of our roughness glossiness on our material. But that's not going to be the case in the real world. And so how we use our roughness map is the rough areas are lighter values and the more glossy areas are darker values. And so one way that we can actually derive that information is by using our normal map. And you can see here that our normal map is going to give us a lot of edge information and surface information. So normally what I'll do is I will take our normal and I will plug that guy into our roughness. And on our normal here, what I'm going to add is a curvature smooth node. And that's going to just basically convert all of our normal information into kind of like height information, where we're going to get nice edge and surface information in a grayscale format. And so that's looking good, but the problem is, like I said earlier, the darker information, the black, indicates glossier areas, whereas the whiter areas indicate rougher areas. And you can see that's going to look a little bit weird when the shiniest parts of our material are in the more recessed parts of the geometry. And so what I do is I normally just take a levels node here and I just go and invert our inputs. And the reason I use a levels node as opposed to a grayscale invert is this just gives you a lot more control over your color values. And so I'm going to increase our black output and our white input, or I guess decrease if we're bringing them inwards, just because we don't want to have anything that's pure white or pure black, because that's going to basically mean absolutely glossy or absolutely rough. And we want to kind of keep it in between. I'm going to bring those in just a little bit more. And so that gives us not too bad of a material. But I want to go ahead and I want to add a little bit more random scatter of roughness information. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to add a, let's take a B&W 3 actually. We'll take this. It's got some nice information. And I'm going to add a blend onto our levels here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy here and I'm going to add a directional warp onto it, because I want the dirt to kind of conform to the geometry or the height information of our height map. And so what I'm going to do with that is come back to our height, just click on this guy here, and I'm going to use that as our input. And so again, once I start playing around, you can see that it's going to kind of conform to the geometry of our height. And if I bump this up to maybe 20, you can see a little bit more that's stretching and bending and warping. And so I like that. So on that guy there, I'm going to plug that in. And I'm just going to play around with the blending modes a little bit to see something that looks good. And I kind of like max lighten, where it's going to keep a little bit of our lighter values up top, but it's also going to keep some of the edge information that we get from our normal map. And again, you can play around with the opacity as well to make it a little more subtle if you want. And this is just going to help further push the effect that we're going to get of our material. I also don't like how glossy I'm still finding the kind of the faces of our wood because it's supposed to be burnt and charred. So I'm going to come back to our levels here. I'm maybe just going to increase our black output, which means that the darker values are going to be lighter in value, so that we're actually going to have a more white looking roughness map. And again, if I play around with the light, that looks much better. And so now we've completed the basis of our charred or burnt wood material. And I want to go ahead and start creating kind of the embers and the glowing flame that we're going to find of pretty much freshly burnt wood. And so to start that, I'm going to come over and first I'm going to create a new output. We'll type in output there. And in this output, I want to come over to our usage and then click on add item and come over to usage. And we want this to be emissive, because we're going to use this to basically just emit light. I'm going to come up to our identifier, type in emissive, and come to our label as well and hit emissive. And then I also want this to be part of the material group. And so the label is just going to be for us to identify it, you can see here. The material group is just going to allow us to use our lazy compact material selection if we're to use this in another graph. So with that selected, what I'm going to do is come back to our height over here, and we're going to use this height. And so I'm going to plug this guy into our emissive. And so with this information, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a levels node on top. And so with this levels node, I want to isolate kind of the lower or recessed areas of our geometry here, because we're going to use this as the basis for creating all of the emissive light. And so what I want to do is first invert our colors here so that our light values are the more recessed of our height or geometry. And then I really want to crank up the black value so that we get only kind of those areas. And then I'm going to crank up the white value so that we get some pretty solid white. And the reason I use this over a histogram scan is just because we have more control with a levels node of our color values. And so now that we've got that kind of range selected, and actually I might bring this down just because of this up here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add over top a slope blur grayscale. And once again, I'm going to add a fractal sum base. And I just want to add some edge distortion to our selection here. Again, do a min. I'm going to come in and play around with the levels. Just to get some good edge destruction. And if I step down one more, that's too far. So I'm going to keep it something like that. And so now what I want to do is I want to add a gradient map onto this guy because we're going to go ahead and start creating the colors. And so I'm going to come into our gradient editor here and I'm going to click on our spectrum once again. I'm going to get rid of the black. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click on this white value here and I'm going to come down to where it says pick, and what pick is going to allow me to do is to select just any color value that I hover my mouse over, and it's going to set our little handle there to that color. So if I do just kind of a pinky red here, you can see that it's going to immediately set this pin to that color. And so I've actually got a chart over here that I'm going to be using, and I will link it below so that you can use the same chart. And I'm just going to be setting each kind of temperature or pin in my spectrum here to a different temperature. So that way we get a nice gradient of heat transfer in our material. So I'm going to come over to our pick here and I'm going to go and pick the whitest value we have on the chart here. And if I bring this guy back over, just that guy there. And so I'm going to take the brightest or the hottest value and I'm just going to work backwards. So I'm going to add another pin there and just select our next lowest. And again, I'm just going to keep doing this process until I have kind of a nice array of different color values. Okay, and so I've got all of the color values right from this guy here. Again, I'll link this in the description below so you can use this exact same chart. And so it's going to give us this kind of nice hot fire transition, and you can see it's looking pretty cool. Now, I find that the issue is there's not too much of a kind of a gradient in between. And so one way we can fix that is I'm going to come back to our levels here. And I'm just going to decrease our white value a little bit. And we can see if I do that, we're going to get a little bit more of a transition. And again, peeling back our black as well, we just get a little bit more variety in our flame here. I also want to come back into our gradient editor. And I just kind of want to space things pretty evenly until we get farther away from our brighter value. So right up at the top here, our hottest values, I'm going to keep them relatively spaced evenly until we get to kind of our orangey area. And then I'm going to bring them a little bit closer together because the transition is going to be much more steep, I'm going to say. And so something like that should give us a pretty cool looking effect. And so now, in order to see our emission, again, I'm going to right click in our graph and view outputs in 3D. And you can see that we're going to get our emission showing up, except everything's going to be tinted red. And the reason for that is because in our gradient, we do have this large red forms kind of over top of our entire material. So I'm going to come back into our gradient editor here. I'm just going to bring this guy down to black. And so immediately after our lowest value here, I'm just going to have a black. And so black light is basically not going to emit anything. And it's just going to allow us to have our flames shine through. And so now we can do something like this, where if we add a histogram scan here, you can see that as we bring the position up, we kind of allow ourselves the parameter of having an adjustable flame.